Our second scripture reading comes from the Old Testament book of Leviticus, which I know you all just go to bed reading every night. It's such a gripping book there. Last week, as you heard, we talked, well, you didn't hear yet. Last week we talked about the rule in the book of Deuteronomy, so another good gripping Old Testament book there, about the rule that every 7 years you forgive each other's debts. Every 7 years slaves are set free. The intent was that no one descends into slavery or homelessness forever. We don't have that generational poverty if your debts are being forgiven every 7 years and if you're being kind of restored there. So that's what we read about last week. Today, our reading from Leviticus takes things a step further. We're going to hear about the Year of Jubilee, which has as its roots God's intent that everybody be made whole. So let's listen for that word. I'm going to read just a little bit from Leviticus 19 and the rest from Leviticus 25. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks and 7 years gives 49 years. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud on the 10th day of the 7th month on the Day of Atonement. You shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land. And you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return every one of you to your property, and every one of you to your family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth, or harvest the unpruned vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat only what the field itself produces. A word of God that is still speaking. Thanks be to God. In 1924, in Southern California, officials condemned the property of Willa and Charles Bruce. They had a beachfront property. They had 12 years earlier built a lodge there for black families to vacation at so they could have a safe place to avoid the harassment and racism that they faced pretty much everywhere else they went. California officials said they needed that property for a public park. So they paid the family pennies on the dollar, but then left it undeveloped for decades. In 2022, California officials returned the land to the Bruce's heirs. This land now worth about $20 million, free and clear. Janice Hahn, who chairs the LA County Board of Supervisors, said, "This is what reparations looks like." It wasn't just about giving back land that had been taken simply because the Bruces were black. It was about acknowledging that a wrong had been done and making efforts to repair that wrong in as far as they were able. You could never completely erase what happened, but they did a step in the right direction. On June 23rd, 2021, the Dwight Mission Camp, which is a conference center that was run by the Presbyterian Church USA, closed, and it gave its land back to the Cherokee Nation it had originally taken it from. That also is what reparations looks like. Now, reparations is an emotionally laden word. We recognize that there have been injustices done, in this case to Native Americans who were forced to sign a treaty that removed them from their land to reservations. Generational poverty is something that is a result. It's one of the fruits of that action there. We look at what has happened to the descendants, well, not just the descendants of American slaves, African-American slaves, but African-Americans themselves in this country as victims of racism that often is rooted not in anything religious or that old idea that because you look different, you must be a sinner, which is some of what was there, but most of it was political and economic, most of what has happened then. But as a result of decisions of saying that because people of a certain color threaten the economic well-being of others in this world, we have For generations, we have excluded them from certain jobs where they have gotten paid less than their white counterparts. Redlining stopped them from being able to buy homes in certain areas, and when they did buy homes, they had to pay exceptionally high prices compared to everybody else. Black Americans who fought in World War II returned back to the States thinking they had the GI Bill, which everybody else who fought in the war could take advantage of, to help them get an education and buy a home, only to find out that they were functionally excluded from that. Colleges would not accept them. Nobody would give them a loan. Nobody would sell to them. So we have this lasting legacy of damage that was done not just to one person, but that has had generational impact. And so we have talked in this country about reparations. How do we make that right, recognizing you could never fully make right something that's already happened? But nonetheless, can we do something to try to make up for that? And of course, the argument is, well, I personally didn't do any of those bad things, so why should I have to pay for it? Or, I worked hard for what I have. Why should I give it up for somebody else, regardless of what happened? So why am I talking about reparations today? Because in a way, that's what the Year of Jubilee was about. As I say, last week we heard about the law that required the release of enslaved Israelites every 7 years and the forgiveness of debts every 7 years. The Year of Jubilee takes that one step further, and the premise is very simple. Every 50 years, land goes back to the original tribe, clan, and family that God first gave it to when the 12 tribes entered the land of Canaan. Every 50 years, the land was restored to its original trustees. So no matter how shrewd you were in acquiring more land, forget passing it on to your heirs, because every 50 years you just have to give it back to where it came from. No recompense, no sale, you just gave it back. Kind of like a cosmic reset where you take the monopoly money and you divide it all equally again. It's probably no surprise that the Year of Jubilee, there is no evidence of it ever being observed at all in the entire biblical record. And I think for the same reason that we struggle with the idea of recompense. It's this basic idea that possession really is 9/10 of the law. What's mine is mine, I worked hard for it, and nobody's going to take it away from me, and nobody else has a right to it. Now, it's easy for us as Christians to say, well, the Year of Jubilee was Old Testament stuff. That's not expected of us anyway. We're New Testament people. But do you know where else we find the Year of Jubilee mentioned in the Scriptures? It comes from Jesus himself. At the very beginning of his ministry, when he laid out what his purpose was, his ministry, it was to bring good news to the poor. Sounds a lot like releasing debts and letting slaves go free, doesn't it? Release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, let the oppressed go free, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The year of the Lord's favor was the Year of Jubilee. And then at the very end of Jesus' ministry, Jesus brings it up again. You probably didn't catch this. When Jesus took the cup and said, "Drink from it, this is my blood of the covenant poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Now, when we read forgiveness, or where we read forgiveness, it is the same word used in the Septuagint, which is the Greek New Testament, which was common in Jesus' day. It's the same word that is used for the Year of Jubilee. When debts were forgiven, fields were allowed to lay fallow and rejuvenate. Lands and homes were returned to their original trustees. At the Last Supper, Jesus says, this is about Jubilee. So the Year of Jubilee frames Jesus' entire ministry, and so it does for us as well. Warren Carter, he's a New Testament professor at Phillips Theological Seminary, says that Well, we have tended to think Jesus was talking about spiritual forgiveness for individual sins, and he's right. That's what we think about when we hear that phrase, spiritual forgiveness for individual sins. He says Jesus was really talking about societal transformations and release from oppressive political, economic, and social systems, which is another way of saying what Jesus was really talking about was restoring wholeness to communities, having respect and caring and mutuality among us in our communal life, which is a very different way of living than we do today, isn't it? The word Jubilee means release. And you don't find it in the Bible in the context of spiritual forgiveness for individual sins. It is always in the context of restoring wholeness to community life, releasing people from the isms that diminish them, healing us, healing those things that separate us from each other, and establishing God's distributive justice, which is a kind of justice that makes sure everyone has what they need to live and grow and thrive so that everyone can experience the abundance and joy that God intends for all people. And by the way, isn't that really what reparations is about? It's not making up for the past. It's healing what has happened so that we can all enjoy the abundance and joyful life God intends. I don't think we're ever going to see the Year of Jubilee enacted in this world. I think it's going to take too many people saying, I'm willing to give up what I think is mine. And I don't see that happening. I'll just be blunt about that. But we still can embrace the ideals of the Year of Jubilee in a way where it's not just about the redistribution of wealth, but it's a way of life that actually gives hope in this crazy world we live in. Because we live in a crazy world. It says we are surrounded by this pervasive myth that says, my success is my own doing. Your success is never your own doing. It is built on the foundation of what people have done before you and the opportunities that crossed your path that may not have crossed somebody else's. We live in a world that says individual ownership is to be prized more than sharing. That's the world we live in. We live in a world that says the way up is to push others down because there's not room enough for everybody up at the top. That's the world we live in. Are you tired of living in that kind of a world? Are you tired of living in the kind of world that says, in order for me to have what I want, you have to lose what you have? Are we tired of living in a world that says violence is the answer to getting what I want? Are we tired of living in a world where we just simply don't value the lives of other people, like what happened in Maine this past week? Are you tired of being measured by how much you have rather than how much you share? You see, the ideals of the Year of Jubilee invite us to live differently than that and to show people that there is a better way, and it is possible right now. So I'm going to lift up just 3 values from the Year of Jubilee that we can do right now. One of the most central ideals is remembering that what we have was never ours to begin with. It belongs to God. You might have noticed that as I was talking about what the Year of Jubilee meant, I talked about giving the land back to the original trustees, not the original owners. Because the land and the earth and everything in it belong to God. Everything we have is a gift from God, given to us in trust, not for our sake, but for the sake of the world. Which, by the way, is what stewardship is about. We are stewards of what God has entrusted to us. Even the hard-earned dollars we have in the bank or maybe hidden under a mattress somewhere are ours to be used in trust for the good of the community. Because when you get right down to it, I am never going to experience the fullness of God's joy unless you do too. So let's work on that together. If we start looking at all of our resources, money, time, things, skills, as held in trust for the sake of others, then we stop thinking as individuals and we start living as God's beloved community. So may your first thought in the morning not be about what belongs to you, but about how you can use what you have to care for others, to build up the community of faith and the community in which you live. Second, Jubilee is about remembering that we belong to a God who loves us and provides for us. Do you all remember the story of manna in the wilderness? The Israelites were on their way from Egypt to Canaan, and food was scarce, and they were hungry, and they were complaining. And God said, fine, I'll give you food. And so in the morning they'd wake up, and there's this white stuff all over the ground, manna, which technically the word literally means, what is this? We think it was kind of something that kind of you could put together and make some sort of a bread kind of a thing. And God said, God had very specific instructions. Everyone was to gather enough for one day, not for the next day. There would be more on the ground the next day, but gather enough for one day. And we're told that no matter how large or small the family was, everyone had all they needed, and no one had more than they needed. Jubilee asks us to trust that everyone will have what they need, that there is enough. In fact, trust is actually built into the year of Jubilee, because it was a year of rest for the land as well. So they were not to plant crops in the year of Jubilee or harvest crops in the year of Jubilee, or eat what was left over from the year before in the fields, because that was a little bit of harvesting there. So if they weren't supposed to plant or harvest, what were they supposed to eat? Well, God provides. God says in the year before, the land will produce 3 times its normal harvest. 1/3 you will eat that year. The next third can be eaten during the year of Jubilee, and then the final third is for the year after the year of Jubilee, because if you weren't able to plant or harvest during the year of Jubilee, when the next year starts, you still have no food. So this holds you over until you can plant and harvest your next crop. So God is asking us to trust that there will be enough. So to live in the spirit of Jubilee is to trust in the faithfulness of God. And if we have trust in the faithfulness of God, then we can share what we have because we know there will be enough. Now, in that manna story, my favorite line in there is not that everyone had enough, but that no one had more than they needed. That's the idea behind returning the land to the original trustees. It recognizes that we get things out of balance. We end up with people who don't have what they need, and we have some who have so much they could never spend it all in 10 lifetimes. There's enough for everyone to have what they need. God has provided. We're the ones who get things out of balance. So the third ideal is to be satisfied with enough. Don't go down that road of overindulgence, and instead share what you have so you can help lift up others who may not have enough. You may be their answer to God's prayer for enough. But we have to be satisfied with enough first. When we live by these 3 ideals, remembering that all we have is a trust from God and is intended to be used for the benefit of the community and not just us, when we trust that God will provide what we need, and when we learn to be satisfied with enough, then we will be Jubilee people. We will be God's beloved community, and we will be a light of hope in this world, showing people that there is a better way. So I have some questions for you to think about this next week, and I'm sorry I do not have them written down anywhere, so if you want them, either write them down, ask me afterwards, and I can send them to you, or listen to the recording of the sermon when it gets put up. Usually it's up by the end of the night here. 5 questions for you to think about in terms of how you might become Jubilee people. How loosely do you hold on to your stuff? Because if you're holding on tight, it's hard to share. If you hold on loosely, you can open your hand and share with others. And it also takes an open hand to be able to reach out and lift others up. So how loosely or how tightly do you hold on to your stuff? Number 2, how will you use what you have? Whether that be time, money, skills, resources, how will you use that to invest in building up the community of this church, the wider community in which you live? How will you use that for the benefit of others? Number 3, what do you need to let go of? What do you have more of than what you need? Not more of than what you want. More of than what you need. And again, where can you invest in that so that others might have what they need? Number 4, similar type of a question, how can you invest in somebody else? Maybe someone that other people don't see. How can you build a relationship with someone who needs what you have? And number 5, how are you going to invest in each other? How are you going to lift each other up? Some things to think about as you think about what it means for you to live as Jubilee people. Let's make 2024 the year of the Jubilee. Amen.